Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the top political stories of the day. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Corey Euclidito, here for Victoria Rose. Thanks for being with us. Today, we're joined by Rob Oldham, who is a Princeton University PhD student. If you're a regular listener, you've probably heard us have a dozen different academics come on and chat about their expertise. But Rob here is the first academic in training. He's also a former Ballotpedia employee. So we figured we'd make an exception for him since he does have that history with Ballotpedia. Before starting grad school, Rob worked on what we call our marquee team with myself and helped us produce a huge historical report on wave elections that occurred in the 100 years between 1918 and 2016 ahead of the 2018 midterms during the Trump presidency. And today he's pursuing his doctorate at Princeton University, studying policymaking in Congress and state legislatures. Rob, thanks for being here.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for having me on, Corey. Great to be back in the Ballotpedia sphere. It's been a few years.
Yeah, so I mentioned it before, you're pursuing your doctorate at Princeton. Tell us a little bit about what you've been up to since you left Ballotpedia.
Yeah, sure. So this is the fifth year of my doctorate program. And yeah, I think maybe at one point in the course of people getting PhDs, all you did was work on your dissertation. But for a modern graduate student, it means you're working in your dissertation plus about, maybe 5 other projects, a couple of which you have hopes of getting published while you're in graduate school. So, so since my second year, I've been working on a variety of research projects that are intended to be turned into journal articles. And then the last year, I've been working on my dissertation. I can give a kind of a brief sense of what the dissertation is about, and then we can talk more about some of the individual papers too, if you want.
Oh, yeah, we'll get to all that. Let's start back with your time at Ballotpedia, though, and revisit our time together, and then we'll progress up to what you're working on now. I wanted to talk about 2 big projects that you worked on here at Ballotpedia. The first I mentioned, which was the wave elections report. We produced that ahead of the 2018 midterms, which were the first midterms under President Trump. Can you tell us what you remember about that research, what it was looking at, and what we found? Yeah,
so we were interested in defining what a wave was. I think, at least if you're really plugged into the kind of political news cycle, you hear this word get thrown around a lot, like blue wave, red wave. Political actors use that, but you also hear commentators and pundits will say that too. So I think what we were trying to do is just give readers more historical context for interpreting a claim like that and being able to say, like, this is how big what's ever about to happen in 2018 is relative to what had happened in the past. And so basically what we did is we looked at all House elections, Senate elections, gubernatorial elections, and state legislative elections going back 100 years. So I think we either started in 1916 or 1918, all the way up to the 2016 elections, so that we could look at how many seats the president's party had lost in midterm elections or in presidential elections. That would kind of give us a benchmark for what 2018 was going to tell us. Basically what we ended up seeing in 2018 was we saw obviously a significant kind of backlash against Trump and the Republican Party, but it wasn't really one of I think it might have been 11 out of, the top, worst elections for a president's party. So it was just outside of the threshold that we would have considered to be a wave, which was the top 10. And then the Senate elections, you actually saw go the other way, mainly a function of the map that we had in 2018, where there were a lot of red state Democrats that were up in states that went pretty heavily for Trump in 2016, and then again in 2020, and there you saw actually Democrats lost a fair number of seats, and it wasn't in the wave category there, but it was still kind of a split verdict in terms of how we had been defining it.
Yeah, that was an interesting and helpful project, and we've been able to evaluate subsequent midterms through that lens as well. So I remember that was a fun project. Another one that I remember that you worked on was the storyline about Texas state legislative primaries in 2018, I guess, around a debate between supporters of Speaker Joe Straus and the House Freedom Caucus. Yeah, tell us a little bit about that work, whatever you do remember of it, because I know there's some intrigue now in Texas after the impeachment of Ken Paxton, and there may be some primaries on the Republican side. So it's interesting to look back at what's happened in the recent past. Yeah,
I would expect there to be some primaries on the Republican side, given that we know that these different groups have a ton of money, and going back at least to 2018. So I'm sure it looks at least pretty similar then to what it does today. If anyone ever goes and finds that project on Ballotpedia's website, I promise you can lose a day or two in looking at all the information that we tried to turn up on the kind of the conflict between, like Corey said, the supporters of Speaker Straus, more or less moderate Republicans, or at least kind of Republicans that were aligned with the business community, and then the House Freedom Caucus was just a more populist Republican, similar to the House Freedom Caucus and Congress, supporters of Trump. Basically what was happening in the conflict at that point was Strauss, was kind of known as a guy who was not really trying to ruffle too many feathers. He wanted to keep the business community happy. So, for example, he didn't bring a bathroom bill onto the floor of the House. He didn't think that would be good for the business climate in Texas, among a few other bills, including some related to property taxes and employee regulations. And so, the Freedom Caucus, they wanted to get rid of as many Strauss supporters as they could so that they could have more influence on the next speaker's election. Strauss actually announced his resignation before the election even happened. So that wasn't even a question of whether he would be speaker again, but whether you would see someone like Strauss that would rise to the speakership, or whether you would see someone who was a little bit more like the Freedom Caucus. Again, kind of like the other story of the 2018 election, it was a split verdict. The Strauss supporters won some elections. The Freedom Caucus won some elections. I think they were a little bit more successful in the Senate than they were in the House, because they also financed some candidates there. And then, from what I understand, the speaker basically aligned with the Strauss camp, probably not as brazen as he was and kind of defying that flank of the Republican Party, but more or less still a business community guy. For Ken Paxton, he wasn't really an issue in that election specifically, but I think you see kind of similar factional lines that were split around Paxton, as you saw in the Strauss versus Freedom Caucus, where you have like the more populist wing of the party supports Paxton, while you have this more business-oriented part of the party that's trying to impeach him. The most recent battle between these two sides.
So those are two of the biggest things that you worked on. Tell us about what made you want to start down the path of an academic. What made you want to sadly leave Ballotpedia and head to Princeton?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say I wanted to leave Ballotpedia. That was just an unfortunate side consequence of me trying to kind of pursue a graduate degree in political science, which I had always wanted to do. I think maybe after getting here, maybe I realized that what I wanted to do is be like one of the teachers that inspired me when I was an undergrad. I had some excellent teachers, including Charles Bullock at the University of Georgia. He's an expert in Southern politics, and his teaching style and his ability to engage with students, that always just really appealed to me, and also connected me to things like internships, to ability to explore the political world and kind of start to develop my thinking around it. That made me think I wanted to do that for help other students do that too. I also had some interesting research opportunities when I was in college with a professor named Tony Madonna. He had us sit around and basically read the congressional record to help with some of his research on congressional amendments and roll calls. And so when I was doing that, reading, what Congress was talking about, as far back as World War II, it had me thinking that I literally don't think that there's another job that I could just sit around and read this document and someone would actually, pay me money or subsidize my lifestyle to do this. So I thought might as well go try to become an academic, because they get paid to kind of do weird things, even if no one else is, super interested in them. So that was, I think, the inspiration was just, coming off of those mentors and kind of figures in my life when I was a bit younger. Coming to grad school, it's obviously it's a little bit more focused around research, less about teaching, but I still like to carry that part of my experience with me, and trying to be a quality instructor to Princeton undergrads and then to other groups.
Yeah, that's great. It sounds like a fantastic fit, and you're doing really well. So let's talk about your work in grad school. So your dissertation, as I understand, it's about congressional policymaking and how that functions during crisis moments versus how Congress acts during moments of what you call politics as usual. What made you want to explore this question before we get to the findings and how you conducted the research?
Yeah, so you might remember, but when I started grad school, there was something that happened in the world. It was called the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't know if you remember that, Corey, but that really that was a huge part of my early grad school experience. I went to classes for the first semester, and then a few weeks into the second semester, and then after that, I didn't attend an in-person class for a year and a half. It really just was a dramatic shock to my life, but then of course Americans and people all over the world were dealing with this thing that no one saw coming, and no one really knew how to make sense of it or fit it into our existing frameworks, at least for a while. And so what interested me about that was at least from I was interested in legislatures and studying Congress, and the amount of money that Congress was appropriating at the beginning of the crisis. This was a kind of unusual time in American politics, but I don't think people often appreciate how unusual it was. The amount of money that was spent in early 2020 was astronomical. So some of our figures have it being more than Congress spent on the New Deal, more than Congress spent on the entirety of the 2009 recession. Even when you combine the New Deal, 2009 recession, it wasn't as much as what they spent on COVID. So this is just again, it's happening in this environment that at least from a political science standpoint, it's like we're more polarized, we're more partisan. Now Trump's president, Trump just got impeached. Like this is not great conditions for lawmaking. Like Congress was able to come together during COVID, and they were able to do this massive spending bill. And so I was interested in kind of how members, were able to make this decision. I guess from the Republican standpoint, how you're able to spend trillions of dollars on these different priorities that previously weren't really priorities before the virus came onto the scene. And then from a Democratic standpoint, how are you able to work with Trump and this guy that you're trying to defeat in the upcoming election? How can you make that actually able to do that on like an interpersonal relationship level? And so that kind of was the start of the project. It later expanded into a more data-driven project where I was looking at kind of similar type events going back 40 years. But yeah, it's been a timely project, I guess, which makes it feel more relevant to the experiences I've had in recent years too. Everyone has.
So what'd you find? What drives the more unique policymaking in those crisis moments? Did you learn anything from particular crises that you examined?
So what I did is I went to Capitol Hill and I talked to people who were involved in COVID, but also the financial crisis and 9/11. So you saw similar dynamics in each crisis, this massive shock that comes onto the scene. And then pretty quickly, bipartisan coalescence around big policy solutions that no one was talking about, no one would have probably thought possible before.
Were these members you were talking to, staff, a combination?
It was primarily high-ranking staff. I talked to one member, but it was normally position of like chief of staff, staff director, legislative director.
What similarities did you find between some of those crises?
So the two big dynamics that I point to in at least the first chapter of the dissertation was when you introduce uncertainty into the environment. Members, they base a lot of their actions on what's worked in the past. So, for example, if you're thinking about like the vote to impeach Trump and you're thinking about that from a Republican standpoint, you might think of it as like, oh yeah, everything I've done so far has basically been in line with what the voters in my party wanted, what my primary electorate wanted, and this has worked out pretty well for me so far. So if I want to continue being an elected official or having policy influence in this area, continue to be a committee chair, whatever that member's goals are, sticking to that kind of politics as usual logic of supporting my party, standing by the president, like that makes sense. But when you have something like COVID that no one was expecting to come onto the scene, no one really knows how to fit it into your frameworks, that can really, I think, throw off that logic. And this is, I call this the problem solving logic. So it shifts from what you do normally into things that you don't do normally. And I guess the modern Congress, that means working across the line. That means negotiating with members of the other party, supporting the case of Republicans, very large amounts of spending. It just involves a kind of a departure from the normal logic that we see in members. And then I think kind of the second dynamic you see going on is you see the environment. Members are always receiving signals from their environment. Like, you talk to constituents and they, tell you to do something. You talk to fellow members and they tell you to do something else. You talk to interest groups, they tell you something else. But in moments of crisis, what I was seeing is that all the messages become very similar. So you no longer have conflicts between these different messengers, and they're all saying the same thing, which is that you have to do something. This is a really intuitive comment or kind of a phrase that you remember for people on Capitol Hill. You'll say, what about the do something? And they're like, oh, the do something. They kind of immediately know what you're talking about. The do something, we're supposed to do something. Inaction is no longer acceptable. Everyone kind of becomes, coalesced behind this idea that something has to change. And I think, often it's kind of vague and unclear and no one really knows what they want to be done. They just know the status quo isn't working. At least they're not happy with the status quo. And they want to see government policy change in some form or fashion. Again, maybe not specific. Maybe in a crisis, that you want protection from your government. You want them to do something to protect you from the bad thing. But it becomes overwhelming and it's difficult for members to ignore.
I don't know if you looked at this, but in those moments, who ends up shaping what the something is? If that makes any sense. No, that's
a great question. So I think, you obviously, if you follow these kind of negotiations a lot, you see a lot of attention on the leaders, and you see, kind of this narrative forms that the leaders are going into these behind the scenes negotiations and they're deciding what's going to happen. And then they kind of throw it out to members. The members just kind of have to swallow it. And I think, there's something to that dynamic. I think it's kind of overblown, though. What I was actually finding was that, part of the reason the leaders are empowered to do this in these moments is because members want them to. at least most members. There's kind of when there is this kind of consensus behind action, then most members are fine with delegating to leaders. And, it's kind of an efficiency mechanism to make Congress work faster. But I didn't really, I wasn't really saying that members were being cut out or that all the details were coming from the leader's office. I think a lot of policy experts really, from both parties, regardless of the kind of the status of, whether government's unified or divided, they can still have influence on what the specifics of the policies look like. You have, administration officials. So in the case of COVID, you had Steve Mnuchin, Secretary of Treasury. He was a pretty influential actor, and that these people are all, kind of helping facilitate the policy negotiation. And then what the leaders are really doing is they're trying to make it politically palatable. So during the financial crisis, you have like Mitch McConnell and Harry Reid, but they weren't really negotiating the specifics of the policy. They were more trying to find ways for their members to be able to swallow the policy and be able to to justify it to their constituents. So it was a much more, I think, symbiotic process than I think you often see. You often see it as more hierarchical, and these people are doing that even though they don't want to because someone else is forcing them to. But I was seeing a lot more cooperation among actors than I think is typically emphasized.
That's a really, really interesting paper. Let's move on to some other things that you've been working on. I understand you've got a paper under review on news coverage related to COVID and how narratives about conflict were more common than they were about cooperation and how this affected legislation. So obviously this, this COVID story and conflict has been a big part of a big running thread in what you're working on. So tell me about that paper.
Yeah, absolutely. So this paper it's kind of following up on this really long-standing observation about media coverage of Congress, which is that it's very negative. And that, this is you mostly see the coverage is about how Congress is fighting about something, not about how they're coming to policy solutions. And so my co-authors and I think one of the reasons we're interested in this is, public approval of Congress is very low. But when you really dig into the numbers, you see that public approval is much lower the more people know about Congress. So people that are more interested in the news and people who are more highly educated, people who we might expect to be following politics a little bit more closely, they dislike Congress even more than the people who aren't paying attention, couldn't tell you who the Speaker of the House was. And so one of the reasons we thought this might be the case is it's the media coverage they're reading is basically inundated with conflict stories, and that you're not really seeing the same amount of coverage for Congress having policy breakthroughs. So we looked at COVID because COVID, as I was kind of describing earlier, at least in our view was call whatever the policy, say whatever about it you want. Maybe you don't think that spending trillions of dollars was the best response to the virus. At the very least, it was not an example of congressional gridlock. Congress, without a doubt, did something, and it was a big thing that they did, good or bad. And so we thought that this was kind of a pretty big counterpoint against these, narratives of conflict. So, if there's any case where you expect to see conflict or coverage of Congress to be a little less conflict oriented or to be, more about policy achievement, then it should have been COVID, particularly, in 2020, when you have all the examples of Congress, again and again and again coming together on these massive appropriations bills, which, by the way, were almost all bipartisan until at the American Rescue Plan in 2021. That was a partisan bill. But everything before that was nearly unanimous. And so we looked at media coverage of those legislative efforts in 2020, and basically we were finding that conflict was still dominating. So you weren't really seeing the successes that Congress was having. You weren't seeing those emphasized. You were still seeing the conflict being overemphasized. So we, constructed an explanation for this. There's kind of the classic explanations, the economic incentives of media organizations to highlight conflict because, readers find it more interesting and entertaining to read about people fighting than they do about policy success. That's part of the answer. Part of the answer is kind of the norms of journalism, which tends to highlight, both sides. So you want to have always a counterpoint to whatever point you make. You always have to have the opposing side. So norms are also playing a role. But then kind of the third thing that we found that, we don't think has been emphasized as much as it's really just the volume and the amount of coverage that media organizations are giving to Congress. So it's the fact that they cover it on a beat structure. If you're going to station someone at Congress and expect them to turn out a story every day or every week or something like that, you're almost inevitably going to cover conflict because, regardless of how many policy breakthroughs it's happening, it's still a legislative institution. It's a deliberative assembly. People in the institution don't agree with each other. So you do get a lot of conflict. It's not like they're making up this conflict. They're covering it. I think we would just argue that the amount to which it's being covered, I think really ends up being very disproportionate to the successes of that. So even during something like COVID, For example, we found that people are still most likely to read articles about failed bills, conflict articles about bills that never even passed, than they are to read about something like the CARES Act, which was the $2 trillion bill that passed at the beginning of 2020. So, there's both the incentives of the media organization, and then there's also the structure of the coverage.
Yeah, I guess one other interesting thing is the finding that coverage of conflicts continues in a moment of congressional unity and action, I guess, doesn't affect Congress's ability to act in that same world of conflict, right? They're still getting things done despite the negative coverage of what's going on.
Yeah. I mean, Congress, that's not a we really look at in the paper, but it is it is an interesting observation, nevertheless, that Congress appears to have incentives to take action, I guess, beyond which they think is going to be covered favorably by the media. I guess that kind of harkens back to my other project. Why members of Congress take action. I think a lot of that is just the uncertainty and the fear of the unknown. That if you don't do something, that doesn't, even if people don't appreciate it when you do something, it's still better than facing the unknown. The fear of what happens if you do nothing 5 months down the road. Who knows what kind of state the country or the economy will be in.
Yeah. What was the process for that research? I mean, were you guys actually just tallying up news clippings and kind of categorizing them? How'd that work?
Yeah, good question. It was actually one of the more in-depth content analysis projects I've ever been involved in. We downloaded about 400 articles, all from the major news organizations, newspapers specifically. We also did some TV coverage, which kind of cuts against our structure argument, which is why we emphasize it. The TV coverage actually does just cover the big events. They don't have these kind of constant conflict models. But anyhow, so what we did was we found about 400 news articles from like the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, Wall Street Journal. And we coded them paragraph by paragraph to see whether the content of the paragraph was about conflict. And so that allowed us to kind of see what was going on in the article overall, like, how many paragraphs in the article were devoted to conflict versus Congress achieving some kind of action. And then it also kind of allowed us to do some other analysis where we saw where reporters or editors were actually placing the information within the article. So, for example, we found if an article talked about both conflict and action, it was far more likely to put the conflict paragraphs towards the top of the article, and less likely the action coverage was being kind of pushed down in the article. You saw that across articles. So that kind of gives you a sense of what their reporters, or at least their editors, are trying to prioritize of what they think should be at the top of the news article, the thing that's most likely to catch the eye of the reader. If we're kind of thinking about the inverted pyramid of news coverage, the idea that people really only read the first few paragraphs and then the rest is kind of extraneous information.
Yeah, I mean, going back to what you said earlier about why you wanted to be an academic, that is exactly one of those things, that you're in the only place in the world where someone will actually pay you a little bit of money to just sift through newspaper clippings like that.
I know. I really hope I never have to get a real job again, I guess, at least.
Oh, that's great. Tell us a little bit about what you're working on now. I understand you've got a paper in progress about what a multi-party system would look like in Congress.
Yeah, so this is a project with Lee Drutman at New America. If you're kind of listening to political reform circles, at least, for a long time, people have talked about introducing proportional representation into how we elect members of the House. You could actually do this without having to change the Constitution. There's just a law, there's a federal law that basically requires that we use single member districts. And so that law could theoretically at least be amended and require that instead of using single member districts, states would have to use multi-member districts to elect their members. And, we would argue at least that those multi-member districts should be proportionally elected. And once you did that, then you basically get rid of the problem of redistricting or gerrymandering, this topic that kind of fills reams and reams of news coverage and academic journal articles, conversations people have about politics. If you do proportional representation, you essentially can eliminate that issue from American politics. So, we find that to at least, be a plausibly attractive idea. And, there's also other potential benefits it could have, like, for example, lessening the us versus them dynamics that you see in a two-party system where people, don't feel that they always have to, vote for a Republican or Democrat, because in proportional systems, usually you have third or fourth parties that emerge.
Yeah, go ahead and actually just briefly define that for everybody. How would proportional representation with multi-member districts actually work in terms of, stepping into the ballot box?
Yeah. So I'll say it could work differently depending on what your what the specific rules are. I'll use kind of a stylized example. So if you could theoretically exist in a district in, say, Georgia, and that district has 7 members of Congress that it sends. And so you as a voter might walk into the ballot box and, for example, you'd see different parties in front of you. So you might see Republicans, Democrats, maybe you'd see the Justice Democrats Party, the MAGA Party. You might see 4 or 5 different parties. And in at least one example of a ballot structure, which we'd call a closed list party system, you could pick just the party that you favored. Let's say you pick the Republicans. And so after everyone votes, the ballot counters, they'll look at how many votes the Republicans received. And if, let's just say Republicans received about 40% of the votes, then that would probably translate to them getting 3 out of 7 seats, depending on how exactly the allocation formula worked. And so what you can see is that if you have multiple parties that actually have a chance of winning, then people might not feel as forced to vote for Democrats or Republicans. They might feel better about voting for say the Libertarians, the Greens, the MAGA Party, the Justice Democrats Party, something like that, because it becomes less zero sum. It's not because you don't elect a Republican that means you have a Democrat, and it's more equal division of the pie.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So when can we expect anything on that paper? Any hard timelines, or is that still to be determined? I think
it'll come out early next year. And to clarify, so that proportional representation is a system that you see that this is a reform. They use it in most other countries. That's a pretty common reform proposal. What our paper specifically is going to focus on is how that would translate into governance and Congress. So that's kind of the big question, because most other systems that have proportional representation, they have parliamentary systems. So like Germany, for example, they elect their legislature, and then their legislature elects a chancellor, and the chancellor is the head of government. And they appoint ministers, often from in the legislature. So that's the UK does. That's what a lot of countries in Europe do, is a parliamentary system. The US has a presidential system, and so it's a little bit it would work a little bit different. The only examples you really see of multi-party presidential systems are often in Latin America. There's a few other examples too, such as Indonesia and Cyprus. But it's a less common arrangement to see is a presidential system where you both elect a president, but then you also have multiple parties. And so our paper is trying to think about under what conditions, basically, is this reform, would it be likely to work? And then what are some other, kind of complementary reforms that we could propose alongside it to increase the chances that it would work? For example, one thing that presidents in Latin America tend to be able to do is they can appoint their own cabinets. They don't have to have them confirmed by the Senate, which is something you have to do in the U.S. So that's something that we're thinking about for our proposal, is how could we give the president more power over the appointment of their cabinet, because it's often useful in a multi-party system to divide the cabinet seats among the different parties in your coalition. That can create bargain. It can make bargaining and negotiation easier for the president when they're trying to get their bills passed and get their program passed. And so that this is just one example of things that the U.S. might want to consider adopting, or at least somehow changing the norms around if we're going to if we wanted to see a multi-party system actually succeed and not lead to further fragmentation, gridlock, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. We'll definitely look forward to that. So yeah, just to get to the end here, start to wrap things up. What's next for you? You've got this paper in the works, but when do you graduate? What's coming up next in life?
Yeah, I mean, we'll say. It kind of remains to be seen. I'll graduate in either the spring of 2024 or the spring of 2025. There's jobs in academia that are out there that I think it's been increasingly common for graduate students to go other paths. I think graduate students that are smarter than I am, they become expert programmers and they go work for like a tech company or something like that. Although that's been less of an option in recent years, as those jobs have kind of dried up a little bit. But I'm clearly interested in research. I'm interested in teaching. I'm interested in kind of jobs kind of in the think tank communities, whether that's in the DC area, maybe the Atlanta area, which is where me and my wife Molly are from originally. So I could see a variety of pathways. I'm not necessarily staking my claim to any single one. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll work out. And any prospective employers listening, Rob is wonderful. Obviously very smart and great to work with. So take that for what it's worth. Well, Rob, thanks so much for your time. It's been really nice catching up. Really fascinating hearing about your work, what you're working on, and I know you stay in touch with a lot of folks here at Ballotpedia. And while we miss you, we're definitely excited to see everything you've been up to.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Corey. It's great getting to talk to you again. And also, of course, I've continued to be a fan of Ballotpedia over the last few years. And I'm very happy to see that the podcast finally came together and that y'all have been getting great guests, even if you have to fill in with some not so great ones like me every once in a while. So I look forward to continued episodes, though, and to all the great work that y'all are doing.
And so for listeners, you can learn more about Rob's work at the link in the show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Corey Eucalito, and thank you for listening.